We're starting with you 15 minutes earlier than usual today. This is a historic day, and it caps off a historic week of reckoning and of steps toward reconciliation around the Catholic Church and its role in Canada's residential school system. In just a few minutes, Pope Francis is set to hold a final public audience with all three Indigenous delegations who traveled to the Vatican this week. They will be joined for the first time by family members, friends, and supporters who made the trip as well. Nearly 200 people all told. That begins around 6 o'clock Eastern, so 15 minutes from now, and we will carry it for you live in its entirety. In these images, you see the delegates leaving their hotel earlier this morning on their way to the Vatican. The final audience today comes after those three separate private meetings between the delegates and Pope Francis. The Métis and the Inuit delegations meeting with the Pope on Monday for about an hour each, and the delegates from the Assembly of First Nations meeting with the Pope yesterday for what turned into 2 hours of talks. There is hope the meetings could be an important step toward realizing one of the calls to action, one of the keys from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, call to action number 58 for a formal papal apology in Canada for the Church's role in the residential school system. First Nations delegates say they're optimistic that apology could be coming soon, and many are hoping to hear more about it during today's final audience. Here is some of what we heard over the course of this past week from the delegates themselves about their initial private meetings with the Pope.
Despite our collection or our collective grief and pain, there comes hope for change.
Today was the most wonderful day I ever had all my life. It helped erase those 20 long years.
We want this new relationship and this relationship of reconciliation to be based on action and also based on mutual shared ambition.
What I took away from this meeting is that he heard. He acknowledged the shame with the Catholic regime.
It gave me a real sense of optimism that we're on the verge of finally turning the corner.
Phil Fontaine, one of the reactions we heard yesterday from the First Nations delegation. Live pictures there of Vatican City, St. Peter's Basilica, one of the most holy shrines in the Catholic Church. And right beside there, in the Sala Clementina, is where the final audience is going to be taking place. And as I said, live coverage to begin in now just about 12 minutes' time. Ian Hannamansing has been co-hosting the National all week from Rome, and what a pleasure it is to have him as part of our live coverage today in St. Peter's Square. Ian, good morning. Thank you for being with us today. You are right there.
Good morning to you.
Thank you, Ian. Right there, Ian, in the square where this is all going to transpire. Maybe I'll get your initial thoughts on the moment and the culmination of this extraordinary week.
Well, first of all, Heather, the scene behind me, I'm sure there are a lot of Canadians who are watching right now who have been here as tourists. It is breathtaking when you first walk down the street that's just to my left here and see St. Peter's Basilica in the background. And it's been that way for us too, even though we've been here all week. Every time we walk up that street, we kind of look at this grand view. And adding to that, of course, is that there has been, at the top of the agenda, this series of meetings with the Indigenous delegates. And so we have a sense here that Canada really matters, that the Indigenous delegations really matter. And one of the, I'll say honestly, one of the gifts, Heather, in covering this story this week has been how open and accessible the delegates have been to us, how generous they've been with their time. And right from those first two meetings on Monday with the Inuit and Métis delegations and continuing yesterday with the Assembly of First Nations delegates, what we heard from person after person after person were two things. The first one was they felt the Pope was listening to them. And secondly, and we heard some of this in the clips that you just played, including from Phil Fontaine, the former Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, optimism. I mean, that's a word that he used. Many other people use the word hope. And so I just talked to one of the delegates a few minutes ago. They're inside, as you point out, the Vatican now, but one was out here just a few minutes ago, and she said to me, she also has hope, but she also has butterflies. We now wait, Heather, for what the Pope will say.
What we expect will be a series of remarks during this hour-long final audience. Ian, you mentioned the Métis delegation led by a 29-year-old woman, the first time a woman has ever been elected the president of the Métis National Council, and that is Cassidy Caron. I'm just going to play a bit of new tape we have, Ian, and then we'll come back on the other side and talk a little bit about her as she details her expectations for today. Here's Cassidy Caron.
We came here so that Pope Francis would listen to our truths, and our elders felt heard. They felt listened to, and it sounds like the similar experience with the ITK delegation and the AFN delegation, and so we really don't know what's going to happen today. But we do know that our stories have been listened to, that our truths have been heard, and that we hope Pope Francis really does translate those words into his heart and maybe some commitment into action.
Cassidy Caron as she was heading to the Vatican this morning. And Ian, again, the Métis story as part of this, the fact that it has been heard. That was one of her goals coming into this as she was laying out there, because they felt that the Métis story has not been as much a part of this conversation as they would have liked over these years. So to have been heard, one of the factors behind the optimism that you just talked about. And I'm wondering what other impressions you've had of people as they've gone into those private meetings with very clear demands, really, of the Church and of the Pope. What have you heard from them on what they are specifically looking for in addition to this apology?
That Heather, there be a commitment that goes beyond a visit to Canada and an apology, whether it were to come from here or during a visit to Canada. I mean, that seems to be kind of the basic expectation of the delegates that I've talked to, and I've talked to quite a few of them. But even though it's the basic expectation, it's just the beginning. That's the other thing I hear time and time again, is that the delegates feel that there are many, many things that have to be done, that the relationship between Indigenous people in Canada and the Catholic Church needs a lot of work to be repaired. So that's one part of it. I would say the other thing too, though, and it's interesting in some of the interviews that I've done with delegates, and for example, an interview I did with Phil Fontaine that's going to be on the National tonight, I asked him what his message was going to be for Canada. And I wondered who he would direct that message to. Would it be Indigenous groups in Canada? But like a few other people, he chose in that moment to send a message back to those of us who aren't Indigenous. And he said, like the way he put it is, it's easy to look at this trip as a distraction. And I said, well, what do you mean by a distraction? And he says a distraction from, the huge issues that confront Canadians in terms of poverty, for example, equality of opportunity, all the things that need to be done to support Indigenous communities. And so he said, even though this is a series of meetings between Indigenous Canadians and the Pope, and the issue here is residential schools and the Roman Catholic Church, he hopes the bigger message, and I've mentioned this is repeated by other delegates as well, the bigger message to non-Indigenous Canadians is this should give energy to the reconciliation efforts that we've seen for a while. So I think that was interesting, because I've certainly talked to people back home who see this as a narrower issue involving the Catholic Church and residential schools. I would say the delegates here see this as a much wider issue.
Look forward to that interview tonight, Ian, with Phil Fontaine. He was one of the very first people to come forward in 1990 and talk about his own personal experiences, physical, sexual, psychological abuse in the 2 residential schools he attended. And his healing journey has taken him to where you are for a second meeting with a Pope. He met with Pope Benedict. So as part of Ian's coverage tonight, you'll see that conversation. As part of our coverage this morning, Ian, if you would just stand by for me, I also want to welcome in Nigan Sinclair, an academic. He is an associate professor and the acting head of the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. He is a commentator and a columnist for the Winnipeg Press. And for us to keep in mind this morning, too, the son of Murray Sinclair, the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Nigan, welcome back. We're delighted to have you as part of our program today.
Bonjour, good morning, and happy to be here.
Happy to be here. You heard a little bit of tape just a moment ago from Cassidy Caron on her way to the Vatican saying she's not really sure what to expect. What do you expect for today?
Well, I think it's widely expected that the Pope's going to announce a trip to Canada sometime later this year. I don't think you'll hear the words of an apology this morning, but I could be surprised. I think it's an issue in which the Pope, if the Pope has been listening all week and is interested in responding to the Indigenous delegations, anything less of a promise to come to Canada to apologize would be an insult, frankly. It would also be disappointing. It would also wonder of what the point of all of this was. And if the Pope is going to come, there's also many different things that have to take place in order for that apology to mean anything. Things like the Canadian Catholic Church committing to fulfilling their financial commitments that they made under the settlement agreement, things like returning land that the Catholic Church has been given, stolen land from Indigenous communities, and then, of course, talking about documents, which has been the thing that has dominated conversation all this week, and materials that are in the Vatican and in Catholic archives.
So an apology, if and when it comes, just the starting point for much more. And we'll be talking about that next steps as we watch what unfolds together, Nigan, there. In the Vatican, we're looking at Sala Clementina, where this is all going to transpire. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that very special place in the Apostolic Palace in just a moment. But I want to ask you, Nigan, as well. This is not the first time an Indigenous delegation from Canada has traveled to meet the Pope. Pope Benedict in 2009, I mentioned in referencing Phil Fontaine, he was there with a small delegation. And Pope Benedict at the time expressed sorrow and talked about the deplorable conditions and the deplorable conduct of members of the Catholic Church, but there was no apology then. What is different this time? What has changed between then and now?
Well, back in 2009, the Catholic Church didn't take this issue very seriously, and it was indicative of the fact that the AFN delegation, there was no Métis or Inuit delegation, heard from Pope Benedict in a very private meeting, a very small statement that was issued in something that had very little fanfare. Certainly, we didn't see the major news outlets covering that particular meeting. Those in the Indigenous community had heard some things about it. Now, what have we heard since 2009? Well, of course, most notably the unmarked graves at Catholic residential school sites across the country. We've also seen the Canadian Council of Bishops resist to pay the legally mandated amounts that they were ordered to pay under the settlement agreement. You know, every other church that ran residential schools has paid their debt to survivors. Why has the Catholic Church not done that up to this point? And then, of course, all of the other abuses. We hadn't even heard from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission back in 2009, and all of the documentation, the survivor testimonies, all of the research that went into what happened at the schools.
Nigan, I don't mean to interrupt you, but a little bit early. Pope Francis has arrived in Sala Clementina. This is Bishop Raymond Poisson, who heads the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, making his introductory remarks. Let's watch live.
Of various origins, Métis, Inuit and First Nations, as well as European and many others, since Canada is an immense, open and multicultural country where the Christian faith finds good soil to bear fruit in view of building a better world. Au nom de mes frères évêques canadiens, je suis heureux de vous présenter les personnes ici présentes venues du Canada pour vous rencontrer.
The president of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops is greeting the Holy Father on behalf of the delegation here, Bishop Raymond Poisson.
Car le Canada est un pays immense, ouvert et multiculturel, où la foi chrétienne trouve une bonne terre afin de donner son fruit en vue de construire un monde meilleur. Most Holy Father, as we all know, our recent history is marked with stigma of mistakes and failures to love our neighbor, in particular towards members of those nations who have been present in Canada for centuries. Our desire for reconciliation is all the greater. Our presence here is a testimony to our commitment for one another and to each other. Sainte Catherine Tekakwita, an emblematic saint of the Church in Canada, accompanies us in our pilgrimage to the See of St. Peter. Apparently, she liked to say, "Who will teach me what is most pleasing to God so that I may do it?" We have therefore come to you, Most Holy Father, people of America, of First Nation, Métis, Inuit, as well as European descent, and so many others, to learn from you what is more pleasing to God in order to accomplish it while walking together on a path of reconciliation. Holy Father, your warm welcome as pastor of the Universal Church is particularly important for all Canadians on this road of reconciliation. Your words, laden with appeals to mercy and reminders of God's tenderness, encourage us in our work of reconciliation. While Saint Catherine invites us to take a path of authenticity and humility together, there is an intimate joy to know that you, Holy Father, are walking with us on his path. Your positive reply to the invitation of your sons and brothers, Bishop of Canada, to visit our country warms the hearts of the Canadian faithful. It is almost as if we are ready today to help you pack your bags. We are filled by the desire to walk together, no matter who we are, our origins or our culture, and by the knowledge that you, Most Holy Father, as pastor of the Universal Church, will remind us of what is the most pleasing to God so that we can accomplish it together. Merci, Très Saint-Père, pour la générosité avec laquelle vous avez rencontré chacun des groupes ici représentés. Avec gratitude et joie, nous sommes heureux de conclure aujourd'hui, avec vous, dans la prière, cette visitation. Thank you, Most Holy Father, for generously meeting with each of these groups here present. It is in prayer with gratitude and joy that we conclude this visit with you today, and thank you for all your blessing. Merci, Très Saint-Père. Santo Padre, all'inizio di questo incontro possiamo pregare un po' con qualche delegati che sono rappresentanti dei loro gruppi. I invite now, for the moment of prayer of this beginning of this audience, the delegate, Elder Fred Kelly from the First Nation, please.
Your Holiness, I come before you humbly, respectfully, invoking the blessings of the Creator, the Great Spirit. And today, Maganito, Dichan Shinavig, Otegam King Avunja Yang, Kavian Dov Magat Oisa, Kanigan of Itang Oe. I thank the organizers of this expedition to come to you, Your Holiness, for me to ask you again to join me in prayer so we can start our deliberations and our discussions. I have had the privilege of holding the pipe to the eastern direction, to the other direction of the south, to the west, and to the north, where the spirits that the Creator has placed in these four directions to guide us, that we may live in peace and harmony with all peoples of the East, the yellows, the blacks to the south, the reds to the west where we come from, and whence you also come from, Your Holiness, the beautiful island that we know as Turtle Island. I also point the pipe, the calumet, sacred calumet, to the north, whence the white bear sits in fierce protection of its children. And we come to you because our ancestors taught us to love our children. And the present generation is here in protection of their own children in the future. So I ask you to pray with me in thought, even though we speak in different languages. It is the spirit of our prayers that are important, not so much the words that we speak. Your Holiness, you understand what I'm talking about. And so I ask, dear Creator, we ask you and implore upon you the sacred gifts, the sacred laws of our peoples that we know as Gajewatazuin: love, kindness, sharing, respect, truth, courage, and humility. May we have the blessings of these gifts from the Holy Creator, the one God that all of us refer to in our different languages and our different spiritualities and our different ways in which we speak, to that one God that we know as the Creator in each in our own languages. Holy Father, may the Creator, the Great Spirit, bless us today as we meet, that we can walk into the future aware that we must allow and follow the 7 laws of creation. And so that we can live not only in peace and harmony, but in the meantime that we can find that reconciliation and the healing that our present generations need, and that our missing and murdered women will also be found and saved. May the grandmother that has re-embraced the remains of our loved ones who have gone to the spirit world, having attended the residential schools, may our children who have been taken away from us be returned to our people, the lovely parents, and may we find that peace and comfort to be with you in the future as brother and sister. Dear Creator, Great Spirit, bless us. We got your Holiness.
Santo Padre, I invite now from the Métis Elder Émile Janvier.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to say a prayer in my Dene language. Et hope is sure in a zone to visit a kidon de die do zinek and without and he delu and in nothing chavani daily. That o chanok that o it o the other light do it the only nor is case Jan was cano no geek no to kazu aba senunut alu the other loud do another who daily. Ja no hananage Métis nation not surroundly who alien was the other loud do that who is only Janoka. Senud alus who yehu and nothing who daily die mercy nor his case. Mercy. At home is true, the kindness is not true, and it does turn death.
Santo Padre, I invite now from the Inuit, Marty and Lizzie, Anguti Aluk. It's for the Pater Noster.
We will sing the Our Father in Inuktitut.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, buongiorno e benvenuti.
Good morning and welcome.
Ringrazio Monsignor Poisson per le sue parole.
I thank Bishop Poisson for his kind words, and each of you for your presence here and for the prayers you have offered to heaven. I'm grateful that you have come to Rome despite the difficulties caused by the pandemic. Over the past days, I have listened attentively to your testimonies. I have brought them to my thoughts and prayers, reflecting on the stories you told and the situations you described. I thank you for having opened your hearts to me, and for expressing by means of this visit your desire for us to journey together.
I
would like to take up a few of the many things that have struck me. Let me start by saying that It is part of your traditional wisdom. It is not only a turn of phrase, but also a view of living. In every deliberation, we must consider the impact on the seventh generation. These are wise words, far-sighted, and the exact opposite of what often happens in our day, when we run after practical and immediate goals without thinking of the future and generations yet to come. Instead, the ties that connect the elderly and the young are essential. They must be cherished and protected lest we lose our historical memory and very identity. They must be cherished and protected, for whenever memory and identity are cherished and protected, we become more human. In these days, a beautiful image kept coming up. You compared yourselves to the branches of a tree. Like those branches, you have spread in different directions. You have experienced various times and seasons, and you have been buffeted by powerful winds, yet you have remained solidly anchored to your roots, which you kept strong. In this way, you've continued to bear fruit, for the branches of a tree grow high only if its roots are deep. I would like to speak of some of those fruits, which deserve to be better known and appreciated. First, your care for the land, which you see not as a resource to be exploited, but as a gift from heaven. For you, the land preserves the memory of your ancestors who rest there. It is a vital setting, making it possible to see each individual's life as part of a greater web of relationships with the Creator, with the human community, with all living species, and with the earth, our common home. All this leads you to seek interior and exterior harmony, to show great love for the family, and to possess a lively sense of community. Then, too, there are the particular riches of your languages, your cultures, your traditions, and your forms of art. These represent a patrimony that belongs not only to you, but to all humanity, for they are expressions of our common humanity. And yet, that tree, rich in fruit, has experienced a tragedy that you described to me in these past days, the tragedy of being uprooted. The chain that passed on knowledge and ways of life in union with the land was broken by a colonialization that lacked respect for you, tore many of you from your vital milieu, and tried to conform you to another mentality. In this way, great harm was done to your identity and your culture. Many families were separated, and great numbers of children fell victim to these attempts to impose a uniformity based on the notion that progress occurs through ideological colonization, following programs devised in offices, rather than the desire to respect the life of peoples. This is something that, unfortunately, and at various levels, still happens today. That is ideological colonization. How many forms of political, ideological, and economic colonization still exists in the world today, driven by greed and thirst for profit, with little concern for peoples, their histories and traditions, and the common home of creation. Sadly, this colonial mentality remains widespread. Let us help each other together to overcome it. Listening to your voices, I was able to enter into and be deeply grieved by the stories of the suffering, hardship, discrimination, and various forms of abuse that some of you experienced, particularly in the residential schools. It's chilling to think of determined efforts to instill a sense of inferiority, to rob people of their cultural identity, to sever their roots, and to consider all the personal and social efforts that this continues to entail, unresolved traumas that have become intergenerational traumas. All this made me feel two things very strongly: indignation and shame. Indignation because it is not right to accept evil, and even worse, to grow accustomed to evil, as if it were an inevitable part of the historical process. No. Without real indignation, without historical memory, and without a commitment to learning from past mistakes, problems remain unresolved and keep coming back. We can see it these days in the case of war. The memory of the past must never be sacrificed at the altar of alleged progress. I also feel shame. I'm saying it now and I'm repeating it. Sorrow and shame for the role that a number of Catholics, particularly those with educational responsibilities, have had in all these things that wounded you, in the abuses you suffered, and in the lack of respect shown for your identity, your culture, and even your spiritual values. All these things are contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. For the deplorable conduct of these members of the Catholic Church, I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry, and I join my brothers, the Canadian bishops, in asking your pardon. Clearly, the content of the faith cannot be transmitted in a way contrary to the faith itself. Jesus taught us to welcome love, serve, and not judge. It is frightening. It is a frightening thing, then, when precisely in the name of the faith, counter-witness is rendered to the gospel.
Che il Creatore rivolge all'umanità all'inizio della Bibbia. Dapprima, dopo la colpa commessa, chiede all'uomo: dove sei?
Your experiences have made me ponder anew these ever-timely questions that the Creator addresses to mankind in the first pages of the Bible. After the first sin, He asks, "Where are you?" Then a few pages later, He asks another question inseparable from the first. Where is your brother? Where are you? Where is your brother? These are questions we should never stop asking. They are the essential questions raised by our conscience, lest we ever forget that we are here on this earth as guardians of the sacredness of life, and thus guardians of our brothers and sisters and of all brother peoples. At the same time, I think with gratitude of all those good and decent believers who, in the name of the faith and with respect, love, and kindness, have enriched your history with the gospel. I think with joy, for example, of the great veneration that many of you have for Saint Anne, the grandmother of Jesus, and I hope to be with you that day. Nowadays, we need to reestablish the covenant between grandparents and grandchildren, between the elderly and the young.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, auspico che gli incontri di questi giorni possano aprire strade ulteriori da percorrere insieme, infondere coraggio e accrescere l'impegno a livello locale.
We need to reestablish the covenant between grandparents and grandchildren, between the elderly and the young, for this is a fundamental prerequisite for the growth of unity in our human family. Dear brothers and sisters, it is my hope that our meetings in these days will point out new paths to be pursued together, instill courage and strength, and lead to greater commitment on the local level. Any truly effective process of healing requires concrete actions. In a fraternal spirit, I encourage the bishops and the Catholic community to continue taking steps towards the transparent search for truth and to foster healing and reconciliation. These steps are part of a journey that can favor the rediscovery and revitalization of your culture, while helping the Church to grow in love, respect, and specific attention to your authentic traditions. I wish to tell you that the Church stands beside you and wants to continue journeying with you. Dialogue is the key to knowledge and sharing, and the bishops of Canada have clearly stated their commitment to continue advancing together with you on a renewed, constructive, fruitful path where encounters and shared projects will be of great help. Dear friends, I have been enriched by your words and even more by your testimonies. You have brought here to Rome a living sense of your communities. I will be happy to benefit again from meeting you when I visit your native lands where your families live. I'm not going to go in winter, So I will close by saying until we meet again in Canada, where I will be able better to express to you my closeness. In the meantime, I assure you of my prayers, and upon you, your families, and your communities, I invoke the blessing of the Creator. Thank you. And I'd like to finish. I don't want to finish without saying a word to you, Brother Bishops. Thank you. Thank you for your courage. Thank you. And humility. The Spirit of the Lord is revealed in humility. Before history, like we've heard, the humiliation of the Church is fruitfulness. It's fruitful. Thank you for your courage. And thank you to all of you.
Those powerful words from Pope Francis.
Grazie mille, Santo Padre, per questo messaggio. E adesso vogliamo prendere qualche minuti per esprimere tra i tre gruppi un'espressione culturale per ringraziare lei per questa accoglienza. I invite now for the cultural expression. The first group is the Inuit by Mr. David Serkoak.
Good Inuit. Good day, Inuit. My name is David Serkoak. I'm very glad to be here in Rome. Thank you. I'm about to share something that is passed on to me from my parents, and I also come from lines of singers and drummers back in 50s and 40s and 30s. When my late father composed a song of Bihik, I hope the sound system will be able to pick it up for me to use it in a few minutes. When a man in my group reaches a maturity, one of the things that he has to do is compose a song or Bihik. It's not a simple song. It's a journey, a trip of many, many. And that special journey, that special hunting trip becomes a song. And this song, or Bihik, I'm about to share with you this morning or today, is composed by my late father, Miki. How songs or be passed on in family circle, sometimes to even strangers. But for my group, after he passed away, his song still lives. Two of my grandsons, named after him, Miki and Ulayo, they are the owners of that song that I'm about to share with you. So I hope the sound system will pick it up. Without further ado, I'd like to demonstrate drum dancing.
Adesso, Santo Padre, invito il gruppo delle Métis. I invite Brianna Lizotte e Alexander Lamoureux for a fiddle music. E Santo Padre adesso, come terzo gruppo dei primi nazioni, I invite Kevin Scott and Melissa Juni Fox for a funny dance.
Is it working?
Cut. Tony Clark, you're on the air. Straight song, straight song, straight song. Contest.
Hey.
Sappiamo, Santo Padre, che alla fine di questa udienza vogliamo fare qualche regali. Allora, in un primo tempo, una persona, due persone di ciascuno dei gruppi, vuoi dare a lei un ufficiale regalo dal gruppo a lei e dopo pensiamo c'è altre persone per ricevere qualcosa della sua santità. Adesso, I invite to give something at our Most Holy Father, a gift, an official gift from the First Nation, Linda Daniels and Adrienne Gunner. Linda Daniels and Adrienne Gunner. I invite you to present your gift at the Holy Father. Penso che ci sono altri. I invite now from the group of the Inuit, Rhoda Ungalak. In the name of the Métis, I invited President Caron, Elder Crérard, Elder Janvier. Come on, Angie, come on. And to receive from the Holy Father an official gift, I invite from the First Nation, I have the name of Adeline Weber and Taylor Tsakosa Ben. In the name of the Inuit, I'm invited Rosemary Londrigan. And in the name of the Métis, I'm invited President Caron, Elder Crera, Elder Janvier. Santo Padre, i miei fratelli vescovi e anche i nostri fratelli e sorelle, chiediamo a lei la sua benedizione e la ringrazio molto.
God bless you all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Pray for me, don't forget. I'll pray for you. Thank you very much for your visit. Bye-bye.
And with a simple wave and a bye-bye, the conclusion of nearly an hour of a public audience, Pope Francis and the Indigenous delegation from Canada. Something we have never seen before in this country. Very powerful over the past hour as the Pope, after having listened to 3 delegations in private meetings, listened, he said, attentively, reflected on it, prayed on it, and then delivered the remarks that those nearly 200 people were gathered in the Sala Clementina to hear. And they heard some of the words that they had hoped to, some of the reasons they traveled to the Vatican and have had those extraordinary meetings over the past week. I want to bring in a couple of special guests who are listening to that live with me. You're watching CBC News Network, and on this Friday morning, I'm Heather Hiscox. In Rome, in the Vatican, in St. Peter's Square, is my colleague Ian Hannah-Mansing, who's been co-hosting The National from that very sacred place for the past week. And Ian, I want to begin with the news. As I mentioned, a couple of main headlines from all of that. There was an apology with very specific language, and there was the promise of a trip to Canada from Pope Francis. What were the details as you heard them?
Well, Heather, first of all, you know, they came after what I think, and I'll leave this to the linguist to analyze, but what felt to me like a beautifully constructed narrative, and some of the language that he used, using the land as a metaphor, trees as a metaphor for Indigenous people and families, talking about those trees being uprooted, and his reference to the Creator. And I'd be interested to know from theologians if that is unusual at all for a Pope to use that term. Certainly we often hear Indigenous people speak of the Creator. So, you know, it was a really interesting speech to hear. And then we got to what will be the 2 headlines, at least today in Canada. You mentioned the apology and the trip to Canada. And let me read a couple of excerpts from his prepared comments. He said, "I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am sorry. And I join my brothers, the Canadian bishops, in asking your pardon." And then in terms of coming to Canada, he said, "Dear friends, I have been enriched by your words and even more by your testimonies. I'll be happy to benefit again from meeting you when I visit your native lands." And so those were the 2 things, Heather, as we've been talking about, that people were hoping for, expecting from the Pope, the apology, the promise to come to Canada. We've heard both of those things, but as I'm sure we'll hear in your coverage this morning, that's just the beginning. On behalf of a lot of Indigenous delegates, they've said that's what they hope for, but they're also hoping for a lot more.
And Ian, if you'll stay with me, because we'll look to those next steps with you in just a moment, but I do want to bring in Nigan Sinclair once again, an academic and also a commentator, and he was listening in. And I want to come to the text of that apology with you in just a moment, but Nigan, let me ask, we heard from one of the delegates yesterday, it was quite moving, I thought, as he said it was a long walk to Rome for those Indigenous delegates. At the end of that long journey, there before the Pope, what was that moment that they received, and how did you view it as you listened to it?
Well, it was a very moving speech, moving perhaps not for the reasons always that would be said with the construction of the speech, but the fact that it was very triggering. And it was a speech that brought up two major issues. One is the Pope talked about the importance of the relationship between grandparents and grandchildren, and that's exactly what was severed by residential schools. And then the discussion around the fruits of the tree, which is talking about the language, culture. He actually used that language. I benefited greatly from seeing your language and culture. But that is almost exactly what the Catholic Church assaulted within those institutions. So it was very triggering. It was very, for any Indigenous person that heard that, I know that I was tearing up, mostly with feelings of anger and feelings of anguish, because of the real fact that we're really talking about the harm that was produced, and this was what the Pope appreciated the most. So it's rather ironic. But the speech itself gave everything needed to take place. The apology, of course, and then of the promise to come to Canada. I mean, there was no mention of sexual, mental, physical abuse, which is what Call to Action 58 is, taking responsibilities for the specifics. So, but the Pope did say that upon hearing of the events within residential schools, he called it chilling. So, I mean, it's important to recognize that perhaps we sometimes expect the litany of things that have been shared with the Pope for him to address. It wasn't quite specific enough to deal with Call to Action 58, and certainly that actually Call to Action can't be fulfilled until he comes to Canada. But it was a speech in which it did everything I think necessary to set the stage for the next step of that relationship.
So, Nigan, let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Yes, you could hear, he said he listened, he was attentive, thought and prayed on the stories, and was deeply grieved by them. But as far as the apology, again, if you look at the specific wording of the Pope's apology, here it is: for the deplorable conduct of those members of the Catholic Church, the perpetrators, those members of the Catholic Church, I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say with you with all my heart, I am very sorry. Do you hear in that an apology for the Church as an institution, or for those individuals within the Church who are responsible for the abuses?
It gestures to some of the important issues around sexual, mental, physical abuse. But the word deplorable, of course, only can be interpreted to what does that really mean, other than the fact that the attitudes, the actions, the very fact that the institutions were institutions of slavery of children, where they were forced to work 16-hour days and then create materials that were sold for their own servitude. I mean, the fact is that, deplorable can mean many different things. I think the speech, though, did enough to gesture to the impact of the discussions around the schools of what took place. And like I said before, we don't want to take away from the fact that many survivors that were in the audience today appeared to appreciate what the words of the Pope are. And truly, if it's good enough for them, then it's good enough for me.
Yes, you certainly saw a very warm reception, particularly Angie Crayer, who's one of the Métis delegates, 85 years old, and she talked earlier this week about receiving an embrace from the Pope, his kindness and his humanity, and how important it was to have had that moment of personal encounter with him, and we saw her as part of the very special audience this morning. Carrying on that apology, I think it'll be interesting to hear from the delegates later on today if they were satisfied by the exact wording of the Pope's apology, because at the end he comes back to it. Perhaps, Nigan, there will be more, because again, he says looks to the future, how the church stands beside you and is looking to a renewed, constructive and fruitful path. And then he says, until we meet again in Canada, where I will be able to better express to you my closeness. Do you think there will be more to come, even a different form of apology, when indeed he does visit this country?
And he also said, that he encourages the steps of the Canadian Council of Bishops, that they take steps in the journeying, advancing, and a shared project of a relationship. So that perhaps may be a gesture to the overwhelming tens of millions of dollars of compensation that the Canadian Council of Bishops should be paying to survivors. And then, of course, all the other things that are necessary, the immediate access of documents, the fact that churches and sites of residential schools are still in the hands of Catholic leadership, stolen from Indigenous communities. I don't think that the Pope is in the business of making directions to the Canadian Council of Bishops to do that work, but certainly is gesturing to that there is still tremendous work to be done by Canadian Catholic leadership to try to rectify this relationship.
You mentioned Call to Action 58, and I think what we'll do, if we could just bring it up on the screen so everyone understands the exact wording, as the delegations have traveled there to the Vatican to ask for this formal papal apology. Call to Action 58 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we call upon the Pope to issue an apology to survivors, their families, and communities for the Roman Catholic Church's role. That's the Church's role in the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in Catholic-run residential schools. And again, it continues that this happened within a year of the issuing of the report. That obviously has not taken place. The report was issued in 2015, and to be delivered by the Pope in Canada. So again, perhaps something differently worded when the Pope travels to Canada at some point, date unspecified. But I'm wondering, Call to Action 58, Nigan, it's really interesting. What is it about this particular call to action that you think has been so difficult to have realized 7 years nearly after the fact?
Yeah, and I think that people rightfully, Canadians, Catholics, Indigenous peoples, have the right to ask, what took the Church so long? Why was what is ultimately the right thing to do so hard for Catholics to take up? And that might be the main issue here, to think about what are the systemic problems within the Church to take this issue seriously. And while back in 2009, Pope Benedict said that he gave a statement of sorrow privately. What has changed since? Well, the public shaming of the Church, for the most part, for the egregious issues, the unmarked graves, the sexual, mental, physical abuse, the fact that the Canadian Church, Canadian leadership of the Church continues to have this outstanding bill involving legally mandated compensation for survivors. The fact is that the Catholic Church just takes so long to do the right thing might be the question of what Catholics want to ask to their own leadership. But then, of course, we have to remember this is a day of promise and of hope, of maybe change. Change will come when it's actions, not when it's words of an apology in the Vatican in Rome. But it is a good first step.
So many questions. I'm so glad you're with us for our extended coverage, Nigan, because there are so many aspects of this to discuss. And I want to come back to that optimism and hope as we continue into the next hour. But I would like to bring in some images and talk about the extraordinary moments that we saw before the Pope in that special ceremonial hall. We heard Our Father in Inuktitut. We saw dance, we heard drums, we heard prayers in Indigenous languages. And of course, central to all of this story is the children who lost language and who lost culture when they left their families. To have that right in the heart of the Vatican, right in the sacred shrine of the Catholic Church. How did that strike you?
It was very emotional. I mean, one of the most powerful things was hearing Fred Kelly, who earlier in the week had given the Pope a gift of a white feather, in fact, calling him white feather, to refer to the Pope in such a way that he began to talk about our shared Creator, the fact that we share a language of the God together in different languages. And then for the Pope to echo that back to Fred Kelly was a profound moment in history in which the leadership of the Catholic Church, I kept thinking back to in the 1530s that there was court trials that was overseen by the Pope involving our Indigenous peoples, human beings, and ultimately the Catholic Church determining that they are not, or they are lesser than human beings. I mean, I was just thinking back to that and going how far and how incredible this moment is to see within the Vatican dance, our ceremonies, our languages being recognized and honored by a Pope in the same way that he would honor his own language, his own culture, his own dance.
Nigan, thank you. If you would just pause with me and stay with me as we continue into the next hour, I want to let you know it is Friday morning. It is the 1st of April, 7:02 Eastern Time. Good morning. I'm Heather Hiscox, and you're watching CBC News Network. I want to show you live pictures of where our focus lies this morning, and that is right there at the Vatican, that famous center, the shrine of the Catholic Church around the world, St. Peter's Basilica, one of the most famous landmarks. And right beside that, in the Apostolic Palace, is the Clementine Hall, Sala Clementina, where we just witnessed an extraordinary hour between Pope Francis and about 200 Indigenous delegates from Canada, a final public audience with the Pope to culminate a week of special private meetings in which 3 different delegations, Métis, Inuit and First Nations, appeared before the Pope, told their stories of the abuses and trauma of the residential school system and the Catholic Church's role in that, and appealed for direct and concrete action. An apology, formal papal apology for the Church's role, for compensation and restitution, for access to documents, for access to artifacts, for the repeal of some of the doctrines that have led to colonial policies, and as well for justice in continuing to track down the perpetrators who are still alive, in some cases outside of Canada. But those were the very concrete list of demands, and the anticipation, the nervous anticipation, the excitement. How would the Pope respond? I want to take you to the Vatican as we begin with this hour with our colleague Ian Hannah-Mansing, who is the co-hosting The National all week from there. And a very special week it was, Ian. And I'm wondering, I'll ask you your impressions of the week overall, but first of all, the news of all of this. In the Pope's 10 minutes of remarks, there were words that the delegates have been waiting to hear.
Yeah, so the 2 headlines, Heather, at this hour, and by the way, here in Rome, just after 1 o'clock on Friday afternoon. First of all, so much demand, hope that there would be an apology delivered somewhere, whether it was at the Vatican or in Canada. Well, we heard it just a short time ago, and I want to read you an excerpt from the Pope's address. He said, "I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry." Words that, of course, many people in Canada have been waiting to hear. And then the other thing that people were hoping for is a pledge to come to Canada. And that was among the last things that the Pope said in what was a very long and carefully constructed speech. But he said, "Dear friends, I have been enriched by your words," as he spoke to the Indigenous delegates, "and even more by your testimonies." And then he said, "You have brought here to Rome a living sense of your communities. I'll be happy to benefit again from meeting you when I visit your native lands." He talked a lot about land. He talked in metaphors that, at least to me, made it clear that he had listened to the testimonies of the people who had spoken to him from the Métis and the Inuit and the First Nations delegations. And that is exactly what the delegates who talked to me said. They felt that Pope Francis had listened to them. And Heather, briefly, let me read you one other excerpt from the Pope's comments where he said, "Any truly effective process of healing requires concrete actions. In a fraternal spirit, I encourage the bishops and the Catholic community to continue taking steps towards the transparent search for truth and to foster healing and reconciliation." You have to think that the use of the words truth and reconciliation were carefully chosen by the Pope, and it'll be interesting to know how the delegates felt when they heard that, Heather.
Yes, we'll be having their formal press briefing set to begin at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, Ian, so that's just over 2 hours from now. Let me ask you, Ian, you referenced that optimism. It was striking to hear Phil Fontaine. I was speaking to him as well yesterday, as you were, Ian, and he said He heard in the private audience, the Pope is with you. And when we saw the delegates emerge, those who held sort of informal meetings with reporters, or scrums as we call them, after their private sessions, there was a real spirit of lightness and brightness. And, you know, I don't know if it approached joy, but certainly very positive. And you wonder, indeed, in some cases, the optimism there is greater than that which some First Nations, Indigenous people in this country feel here, right at this moment. What did they tell you about what transpired in those meetings that gave them such hope?
Yeah, so first of all, Heather, I absolutely agree with all of that analysis. There's a lot of reason for people in Canada, Indigenous people, to feel pessimistic, to be cynical, to wonder what might happen, what might have happened this week, and what might happen going forward. And so right from the beginning, on Monday, when the Inuit and Métis delegation spoke to the Pope, and when some of the delegates came over to speak to us, and I want to point something out. We came to Rome very mindful of the fact that we wanted to give delegates distance. We knew that this could be a difficult emotional time for them, but there's a hotel where many of the delegates and reporters are staying. And just being in the lobby there, we had lots of people coming up to us. And then when I would start to talk to them about the meetings, they were quite open about what happened. So that was interesting. And then they started talking about how they felt. And every once in a while I would say, it sounds like you're optimistic. And I was expecting them to say, oh, no, we're not optimistic. Some people were a little bit guarded, but others agreed. They were optimistic, they were hopeful, and it was because, and I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating, every single delegate I spoke to, and there were quite a few, said that in each of the three meetings with Métis, with Inuit, and with First Nations delegates, in each of those three meetings, they felt the Pope had listened to them, and that gave them hope, and also that he made comments at the end, the Pope did, to each of the delegations that also reflected that. It was one other thing. I remember one of the delegates telling me after one of the meetings on Monday that they had gotten towards the end of the allotted 1 hour time, and someone from the Catholic Church in the room, I don't know if he looked at his watch or made some sort of signal that time has come up, and that the Pope kind of brushed off that signal and made it clear to everybody that he wanted this to continue. They wanted people to talk. And yesterday, Heather, as you'll probably remember, when the Assembly of First Nations delegation was there, it was supposed to be 1 hour. It went 2 hours. And remember, those sessions were delegates talking to the Pope. So he extended that to listen, and presumably some of that listening was reflected in what he said today.
Ian, thank you, and stay with me if you would as we continue with this special coverage. I want to bring back Nigan St. Clair, and let me reintroduce him to you. He was part of our broadcast when we went on extra early this morning. He's an academic, he's an associate professor and the acting head of the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. He's a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press, and we're really enjoying his insight this morning. Nigan, let me pick up on what I was just discussing with Ian there in terms of the optimism that we heard from the delegates, speaking of the encounters with Pope Francis as a divine moment, as a profound moment, and talking of the hope and optimism. And yet here in Canada, some look to what is happening at the Vatican and saying it's essentially pointless because the damage is done. The damage cannot be undone. And there's really little worth in going to seek an apology from the Pope at this point. What do you think about that? And do you think perhaps what's happened that we've just seen live might change that?
Yeah, and the land is still stolen. The intergenerational harm is still present. The fact that there is massive amount of poverty and tremendous trauma that still exists within our communities. I mean, those are all very real concerns. So let's give them and those who express concern about this visit, or the fact that many don't appreciate the gifts that are offered to the Pope, in the fact that the very materials that we have been refused to have access to are those things that are stolen from communities. So the wounds are real, and they're also still very present. But there was a moment this week where we heard Angie Creer from the Métis delegation, who said she was blown away by the fact that she was able to hug the Pope. And not only is that kind of abnormal these days in a pandemic world, but it's indicative that the survivors that attended in these 3 delegations, and all 3 delegations had survivors. Let's just all take a moment to realize how brave and remarkable it is to go to the Vatican and share your experiences, most of which are traumatic, very difficult stories to talk about, being taken away from your parents, suffering tremendous atrocities in residential schools, and then continue to carry those and have the Pope then respond by saying the word intergenerational trauma and talking about the words intergenerational harm. I mean, that's a important moment, and that for survivors, that's an opportunity to be heard, much like we saw during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And while we pay a great deal of attention in Canada about the TRC, the fact that the words truth and reconciliation left the Pope says that this is now a global phenomenon. This is a global issue in which you saw international media paying attention to the work that survivors were doing to advocate for themselves and their stories and their experiences, to have that be heard by Catholic leadership, and then to, in many ways, step up, to demand, to ensure that the Pope, way off in the Vatican, makes an acknowledgement of those experiences, and then promises to come to Canada to offer those words of apology. And hopefully this will inspire change, much needed change.
Nigan, we're going to continue talking. I just want to say our camera is on the move there in St. Peter's Square, because we are beginning to see the delegates emerge from that special ceremonial hall. And hopefully we will hear some comments for some immediate reaction from them. We do know there's a formal press briefing set for 9:30, so in about 2 hours' time. But we have heard from some of the delegates immediately afterward. And so the drums and the dance in St. Peter's Square, again, the ceremony is so central to this story. We'll watch those live. But I want to continue with one of the points that you made as we keep an eye on this. Some of the gifts that were presented today. There have been gifts presented to the Pope all through the week, but we're going to look at some of them and tell some of the, I'd like you to tell us about some of the significance, if you can. From the Métis delegation, there was a book of memories. They asked the elders, they asked the members of the Métis Nation what they wanted to give to the Pope, and they said, bring our stories. We could overhear President Cassidy Caron tell the Pope that, so their stories. So a book of memories to the Pope, the stories of residential schools, and you see in the pictures the buses waiting to pick up children and the experiences in those classrooms and the stories that went with that. From the Inuit, just this extraordinary cross and pouch, and we really have to indicate the people who made that, because they are real artisans. The Nunavut Arctic College, the jewelry program, instructors and students created this cross and pouch, baleen from a bowhead whale, a lot of symbolism there, sealskin pouch, ivory, sterling silver, 18-karat gold. That was from the Inuit. And from the First Nations delegation, 2 things. There was a beaded leather stole we saw, and Phil Fontaine, one of those who presented it to the Pope, and also a snowshoe, black ash, caribou sinew, and a sinew, and that was presented as well by a number of the elders and delegates from the First Nation. So as you watch those gifts presented to the Pope, again, what were you thinking? And just share with us what we should understand in terms of their significance.
Well, gifts in our cultures, in Inuit, First Nations, Métis cultures, they have tremendous symbolism. There's much bigger message than the object itself. And if we were to take a look at example, the Métis gift, I mean, the Métis have said time and time again that they have been left out of the process of reconciliation around residential schools in the country. They weren't a part of the settlement agreement. While the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did work very hard upon hearing stories and producing a volume that they didn't have to do, but they produced a volume about Métis stories as a part of the final report of the TRC. This is indicative of the Métis still saying, in fact, you heard one of the Métis delegates, Mitch Case, who was talking about in his speech being left out of that process. Not our Métis survivors still not being able to tell their stories. So in this case, literally presenting stories of Métis experience in the residential schools is incredibly symbolic. And then, of course, for the Inuit, many of whom are one of the strongest sort of sectors of Catholicism in the country, I mean, you see a real profound moment of relationship and kinship, much like saying, we understand, we want to build a relationship using your language, and which the Inuit have done. And also some of the fact that the minerals that are being used within those, like gold, are talking about some of the extraction processes that have been a result of colonization in the north. And then, of course, the AFN. The AFN has been presenting gifts all week, most notably a cradle board that they offered to the Pope. It was expected that the Pope would return that cradle board as directed by the AFN. So I'm not sure if that's happening informally, because it didn't happen during this ceremony. When that cradle board was offered to the Pope, it was said that as you handle this cradle board, it will be indicative of what you are expressing in relation to residential schools, which were our children taken from us forcibly, which we are now taking back and offering you this to take care of for the time being. But of course, the AFN is also about handing over those materials, things like the beaded items and the snowshoes. These are all things that are indicative of the same kinds of cultural fabric, the cultural foundation that residential schools were seeking to assimilate and eradicate. So that too were incredibly symbolic gifts that tell stories that the Pope is then expected in some way to think about and ponder moving forward in the future, perhaps at a future visit to Canada.
Nigan, just pause with me, if you will. Yes, that cradle board, maybe we'll hear more at the formal briefing. We were waiting to see the Pope's response. That traditional tool for carrying infants, as they explained it to us yesterday, a symbol of every child who attended the residential schools and of those who never returned. So we will perhaps hear more about that. But Nigan, I want to just go back to our microphone in St. Peter's Square. This is Nathan Obed, who is in charge of the Inuit delegation, and beside him, Cassidy Caron, the president of the Métis National Council. Let's listen in live.
We at ITK look forward to working with the Canadian Council of Bishops and the Vatican to not only plan for this message to be brought to Canada and to our people in our homelands, but also to see action that really will be the hallmark of this reconciliation journey with the Church. Thank you so much for being a part of this with us. And I also want to thank Chief Antoine and President Caron for the work that we have done together to make this all possible. Nakumi.
Merci. Merci. Bonjour. It's good to see each one of you. I'd like to thank my sister and also my brother for being here with all our delegation, and also leading our delegation, so that way we could be able to come back together, as we have always been challenged because of the Indian residential school system and also the doctrine of discovery. Our family, like branches on a tree, we all grow in different directions, yet our root remains the same. I'm not quite sure who the author is, but I just wanted to let the author know that we're using this in a good way, and we'd like to acknowledge that author. 3 adopted children saw this message, and in their friendship, they shared this message with me. And I'd like to acknowledge the children. Today is a day that we've been waiting for, and certainly one that will be uplifted in our history. His Holiness Pope Francis, head of the Catholic Church, has issued a long overdue apology for the Roman Catholic role in church-run residential schools. It's a historical first step. However, only a first step. More news to be done to address the Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action number 58. The next step is for the Holy Father to apologize to our family at their home. We seek to hear his words. They also seek their words of apology at home. I think it's very historic, and as you can see, the natural divine moment that we have, even by the natural power of the Spirit out there, it has shone a spotlight, a natural spotlight to all the things that our people have endured, and also all of the people over here on this side also have endured. As I mentioned yesterday and the day before about these two images of two people pointing fingers at each other and almost touching. That is a very divine moment that somebody laid on his back and looking up in the sky and drew that illustration. And it's really a privilege for all of us, my sister and my brother and all our delegations, to be part of this moment. None of this would have been possible without the collaboration and strength of our family. I'd like to thank our grandparents, our parents, our children, and our grandchildren, and also the leadership, my sister here, and and also my brother and other leadership, and all those other leadership that have also helped us to be able to be coordinated and to be focused. We hope that if this visit does occur, that we are not only involved, however, active partners in the planning and also the determination of location and sites for the Pope to tour. Why? Because it's our home. We came here to your home, and they were involved with it. And in terms of moving forward, they need to also respect that this is our home. This is our family's home, and our family needs to be involved in it. It would be a disappointment after all our work this week and all the history that's been written so far to not be included at the decision-making table for this visit. We accept this apology as a gesture of good faith that acknowledges that he will come to our home, Turtle Island, and to formally apologize to all our family. And so with that, say masi nere sinethe joka jon sehe natsare jam de da ka slik atatsri de on da ejiga kandida masi enethe. Ejia jon kandi nadate say masi nere sinethe ka jon kandi da kandi meta when da tega ne de a jon meta de siago. So today, I thank you for being here, and I thank you for doing your best to also tell the story of this truth. It's really important that the skills that you have, the reasons why you do this, is that you also share the truth that we've been saying. That would be very respectful, and so that way the global family out there, they can also benefit from what we're doing here. So I'd like to thank you and hamasi.
We'll take 2 or 3 questions. Please state your media outlet, and I'll call you.
Willow Fiddler, Globe and Mail. This has been such a long time coming, as you have mentioned, and although it's not quite the apology that will happen, that you hope to happen in Canada, can you just describe the moment, what it was like to hear those words spoken to you today?
For me, I was deeply moved when we were reading along in English the words of the Pope, and I was sitting next to my elder, Angie Crier, who has been with me along this journey the entire time. She's the one who brought me around our Métis Nation homeland to hear the stories of our survivors. And when Angie and I were sharing a book and reading the book together, I pointed out the words, "I am sorry." She broke down into tears, and it was so moving because I know how important that is to her, and I know how important those words are going to be to our survivors back at home. which is why we will continue to advocate for Pope Francis to share those words, those sentiments, what he's learned and what he's heard from us back on our homelands.
Behind the cover-ups, behind the indifference over 100 years, behind the lies, behind the lack of justice, this Pope, Pope Francis, decided to go right through it and decided to speak words that First Nations, Inuit and Métis have been longing to hear for decades. It will be now up to us as Indigenous people on how we internalize that and how we respond to it. But in the moment, I couldn't help but thinking about how people can change the world and how individuals can see that there is justice and that there is a path towards justice. And it certainly made me think of all the other people who can act with us in paths to justice associated with reconciliation and also the justice for sexual abuse and violence against children that still have not come to justice in this country.
Masi, the moment is like our family going out on the land, their home, and they want to go and put food on the table. The moment is like when you're going out there in the snow and you see fresh moose tracks. That's the feeling that I have, because there's a possibility. However, you have to also still do your knowledge. You need to use the knowledge that we have to live with the land, to also put food on the table. Is that you still need to do work. You still need to go tracking that moose. You still need to look at the elements, the wind, the sun, and where the moose goes. These are all the things that we all have learned to be who we are, to put food on the table. And so that moment is very special. The other thing is that when you go put your fish net in the water like this, you don't know what you're going to catch, but you're very hopeful because you try your best to do the things that you need to do to put things in place. And so you have to really rely and trust the natural processes that need to happen. And so we're very hopeful that these things have been done. We have set that fish net there. We also saw that fresh moose track, and we'll see how things are as we move forward. Masi. This is a very huge issue. It started off with the doctrine of discovery, where the direction is to say, go out there and do whatever that had happened that we've been telling you. And that was not a good way to go forth. And so when we offered that cradle, and we suggested that to keep it overnight, the way that I see it is that it's going to take a few more days for him to think about that, because it is a very huge, enormous issue, because it has to do with our family. And also it had to do with the ones that are most vulnerable, our children. And so it is a huge issue. And I know with the words that he has shared with us, the words that my sister and my brother shared, the way that we had collectively look at this, he certainly has a few days to go. And I know that when he does come, I'm sure that cradle will be accompanying him. Masi.
Thank you. Last question. Will your delegation be involved in the planning for Pope Francis's
Before we came here, we were only in preliminary discussions with the Conference of Catholic Bishops, and we have yet to fully understand the process that goes into planning a papal visit, but it is our expressed desire to be partners in planning for the papal visit to Canada so that we can ensure that Pope Francis visits the most meaningful and spiritual places of our families and our communities.
I'm just going to go back a little bit. As you can see, our family, as you've also been shared with a glimpse of our culture and our spirituality, with the things that we've experienced, and with the delegation, I'm sure you also had experiences too, is with the requirements of the preventative measures. We were only looking at each other through TV or listening through the audio system. And it was so amazing that we got together here and we began to really humanize with each other. And so because of these things, we showed you that it is very important to be humanized. And so our message to the world is that we are all in this together. We're human beings. Let's work together to humanize the way we need to with Mother Earth. Masi. Yeah, Masi. Now let's go dance.
Kidding. Yes, yes, please, yes, thank you.
You've been watching live coverage here on CBC News Network of the heads of the delegations. That's Phil Fontaine stepping up to the microphone, I believe, to talk to us, but we'll let him get set as we bring you the responses from the heads of the three delegations, each of which had a private meeting with Pope Francis, and all together with their families, with story keepers, with elders, with spiritual leaders, with their children, as they heard Pope Francis in that final public audience that you saw live here on CBC News Network. And you heard him deliver what they called a long overdue apology. That was Gerald Antoine, who is the lead delegate for the Assembly of First Nations. Today is a day that we have been waiting for, is what he said, with the Pope issuing a long overdue apology. But he said, indeed, this is just a first step, and that's something we've heard from the other leaders as well. The next step is to deliver an apology to the families at home in Canada on what they hope will be Indigenous land. They want to have those words of apology at home. And they talked about the moment of hearing the words, I am sorry. And for the head of the Inuit delegation, Nathan Obed, again, something that they have been longing to hear for decades is how he described it. A moment where he realized how people can change the world and individuals can see there is justice and there is a path towards justice. Not there yet, but a path toward justice. And also feeling from Cassidy Caron how deeply moved she was, the leader of the president of the Métis National Council, how she was moved, and how the elder beside her, Angie Crair, one of the elders who told her stories to Pope Francis in their private meeting, how she broke down at hearing the words that the Pope uttered. I am very sorry. And as he said, I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry. Some of the cultural performances that we'll talk about on CBC News Network. Pope Francis very much enjoying the Métis fiddlers. We played some of their music earlier this week. Let's take you back to St. Peter's Square. Again, Phil Fontaine at the microphone.
I think I would hear him say how he felt shame for and guilt for what the church did to our people, and that he was prepared to come to Canada to meet with our people and visit our communities and speak directly to Indigenous peoples, especially those that were hurt by the experience. So it's a pretty big day. I remember 2009. The outcome was considerably different from today's outcome, but I see 2009 as one step in a number of steps that we had to take to bring us here, and we had to put pressure at every step of the way to convince not just the church to accept our stories, to accept our position for an apology, but in our case, Canadians didn't. It didn't matter to Canadians until, of course, the Kamloops situation kind of shocked the country, and it became an international story. And from that point on, as I've said here, the world was watching and has been watching. And I'm sure that they might be a bit surprised that Pope Francis said, "I am sorry," right? And in our case, we are ecstatic. And so
there was the exchange of gifts. There was a lot of smiles. We couldn't hear what was being said. You were right up there. Were there any words exchanged privately between you and the Holy Father at that moment?
Well, when I went with the two First Nations women, we just expressed our thanks for the gathering, and that our gift to him was an expression of our gratitude for what had occurred, and he had the biggest smile on his face that I thought I wouldn't see, and so that made me feel
There's a good
very...
picture somewhere.
Yes.
It was sort of hard to hear and see, but did you receive a bronze olive branch from the Pope?
Well,
Was that part of the exchange?
that was his gift to us.
And what's your reaction to that symbol?
Well, the olive branch is important to all peoples that believe in peace and harmony, and we certainly do, and we accept that as their commitment to. Well, I don't know if this might be overstating it, but to bring peace to our lands. Really, it is more a reflection, in our view, in my view, a commitment on his part to fix things, to better the lives of our people. And the first step in that is the apology. And then we work out together the work that needs to be done to address all of the very difficult situations that exist in so many parts of the country. So we think this is a wonderful start to this process of engagement with the Catholic Church.
Phil,
Yeah?
you spoke, you were one of the first survivors to speak publicly about the abuses you experienced in residential school more than 30 years ago now. There are so many others who are no longer here. Do you have a message to the survivors and their families back home? And what does this mean for them?
Well, this moment, I think, reflects that the determination and the courage of many that kept up the fight over the years, and it's really about never losing hope. Pardon? I don't have any change.
Spaghetti, hungry.
But
Spaghetti, hungry. Yeah, spaghetti, fight.
Come on, Phil.
Espera, mamma, da, mamma, da. Spaghetti.
Here. Give her a blessing.
Thank you very much.
Spaghetti, spaghetti.
But get good spaghetti.
Ah, Mama, yeah. Thank you.
She took over the press conference. Yeah, she's had her moment. Yeah. Oh. Well, the apology has always been, an apology has always been problematic for the senior officials in the church, because they obviously they were advised if they apologized, they would assume some liability, but one shouldn't overlook the Indian residential school settlement, the largest class action lawsuit in the history of the country, and what followed from that $6 billion deal included the TRC, the 94 calls to action, the principles of reconciliation, and a number of other things. And the mistake the Catholic Church made was making a commitment to raise $25 million to pay their share of the compensation package. They were unsuccessful. They failed. And I was part of the fundraising committee. And at that point, Canadians weren't interested in supporting, in their view, a wealthy institution. The church congregations certainly didn't come true, so they failed. They've recommitted now to raise, what, $30 million over the next 5 years. I think they'll do better with this effort. I'm convinced of that.
You were talking about the pressure over the years on the Catholic Church and apology. And yesterday you said in the press conference that there would be a huge disappointment if Pope didn't announce he was coming on, and he was. Was that just an expression of optimism, or were you hoping that you might influence the announcement today? And did you?
Well, I was optimistic, but I didn't have an inside track to what the Vatican was up to, and so when I read the statement, of course I was more than pleasantly surprised. But I'd been pushing that for that possibility as often as I could, and the other piece, of course, we shouldn't overlook in that decision is that I believe that Winnipeg, St. Boniface, would be an ideal place for the Pope to come.
In January.
Pardon?
In January. He didn't make that clear.
Not in wintertime, but he's coming this summer. Yeah.
So, Phil.
Oh, I'm not the Pope, by the way. but I'm just guessing it'll be in July. I didn't hear that. I have the statement in my pocket. I don't believe it said that. Then one of the archbishops said, "How about Lac Saint Anne and a pilgrimage site?" So there'll be competing, communities that'll be competing for the Pope's attention and the officials of the church to choose their community over another. Oh gosh, huge difference. I'm relieved would be a terrible choice of words. I'm very happy. It's the culmination of years of work, if I can describe it as work. It wasn't, but it was a passion of mine for such a long time, and we finally achieved the success that we were hoping for. and there are many, many people that were part of this journey. So I'm feeling pretty good.
So you were saying that even when you walked into the room before you got the statement, you weren't sure if there'd be an apology. And obviously you expressed outwardly optimism, but what did you actually feel? What went through your head when you saw those words?
Oh gosh, I was pretty happy. As I said, a bit unexpected on my part, but he even went beyond what I'd hoped to hear from him when he talked about feeling shame and guilt for what had been done to our people. So it was a pretty happy moment. Yeah. Very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Phil Fontaine, who's been central to this story for decades in Canada. As a boy, he attended 2 residential schools, and later in 1990, actually in a famous interview with Barbara Frum on this network, was one of the first to talk about the physical, psychological, and sexual abuse of people in residential schools. He one of the survivors. Of course, he was the chief of the Manitoba Chiefs, served 3 terms as the national chief for the Assembly of First Nations in this country, and was integral to that settlement that he mentioned, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, $6 billion. He was there for apologies in the House. He's already met with one pope, and today, as you heard, a very happy day for him when Pope Francis went even beyond what he had hoped to hear from his seat in the front row, talked about shame and guilt, and apologized. As Phil Fontaine just said, it was a pretty happy moment. As you're watching live on CBC News Network, I'm Heather Hiscox on this Friday morning. 2 hours ago, we went on the air with you for this historic moment, the culmination of a week of private meetings and a public audience in which Pope Francis told the delegates, and we have seen live, as he's told the world really, delivering an apology to the Métis, Inuit, First Nations people, the delegates who traveled to see him in Rome, apologizing for the deplorable conduct of the members of the Catholic Church who committed the abuses all those decades ago, and asking for God's forgiveness. I am very sorry, he said, and then announcing that he would be traveling to Canada at some point. You heard Phil Fontaine say he thinks it will be in July, to speak further about it. Perhaps different wording, but to speak to the families and those here in this country. Looking at scenes of the cultural exchanges, the drumming, the dancing, the music. That was the conclusion of the ceremony today. Nigan Sinclair is with me, and before I let you go, Nigan, I want to say thank you so much for all of your insight. A couple of questions for you. You just heard some of the discussion about the gifts that were presented to the Pope, but also a little bit about the gifts that the Pope presented to the individual delegations. There were olive branches as part of that, and that's something that really stood out for you. Why?
Well, we talked a lot about the symbolism of the First Nations, Inuit and Métis delegations and the gifts that they offered to the Pope. But, you know, offering an olive branch from the Pope to the Indigenous delegations. People might be wondering what that is, and you certainly heard Phil Fontaine, who attended Catholic residential school, would have heard this story, you know, talking about it representing peace. So in Genesis 7 in the Bible, Noah, the world is flooded, and of course Noah's Ark, everybody knows that story. He sends out a dove, and he sends it out for over several different days. And finally, on the after the 7th day, that dove returns with an olive branch, which will show that the flood is receding, the flood is over. And so that use of that olive branch is an indication from the Pope, or certainly an intention by the Pope, to perhaps begin to show the change in the church, the perhaps ending, although it's hard for me to say this, the ending of the violence of the church, which is still happening today and still very much part of the legacy of the church within our communities. And perhaps the flooding of our communities, the flooding of colonization and trauma and genocide will begin to recede. that will be what the hope of that gift will represent, and the hope would be, will the actions come after the apology?
Nigan, I'd like to ask you too, in conclusion, again, we're listening to the Pope there just in the ambience. We're going to play the Pope's remarks in their entirety in just a moment. But one of the additional benefits of speaking to you today is not only your own personal credentials, but you're also the son of Murray Sinclair, the former senator, and critically the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I don't know if you've had conversations with him over this week, but struck listening to Phil Fontaine saying we are ecstatic. This is a pretty big day, that this went even beyond what he had expected. What do you think your father will be thinking today with this apology? How will he interpret it?
Well, I speak to my father all the time, and so, but we talk about many things involving this moment, and one of the things that he expressed to me is that it's of central importance that survivors in Canada face the Pope face to face, and that the Pope, when making that apology, show his sincerity, show his commitment, and that it has to take place on the lands, and in many cases the lands that were stolen by the church continue to be stolen by the church, and that begin to not just represent symbolically, but to signal a change in this country that will begin to rectify the harms of the past and move together in a more meaningful way, make a country different than what we've inherited.
Nigan, to quote again from the Pope's remarks, sounds like there will be that more fulsome apology to come. He concluded by saying, until we meet again in Canada, where I will be able to better express to you my closeness. So, to be continued, perhaps, is how we view this, and we'll look forward to getting a date for all of that. May I thank you for today, for Monday. You were part of special coverage as we began this week. Thank you for this morning, Nigan Sinclair. I very much appreciate your perspective on all of this.
Miigwech, and thanks for your including me in this coverage.
So you are watching CBC News Network. I'm Heather Hiscox. It is 8 minutes before 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and we're going to keep a watch on what is happening in Rome and at the Vatican, because there is a formal press briefing from the delegates. We heard part of their comments there, but something more formal and probably more lengthy, beginning at around 9:30 Eastern. We'll have that for you in its entirety. But as you're just joining us, again, the two main highlights and the stories that we're hearing from the delegates they have taken away. Number one, the apology from Pope Francis for the deplorable conduct of those members of the Catholic Church. His statement going on to say, I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry. And then announcing that he will be traveling to Canada, and there will be more to come on the path that they continue to walk together toward reconciliation. For the next 10 minutes, we're going to play the Pope's remarks in their entirety here on CBC News Network.
I'm grateful that you have come to Rome despite the difficulties caused by the pandemic. Over the past days, I have listened attentively to your testimonies. I have brought them to my thoughts and prayers, reflecting on the stories you told and the situations you described. I thank you for having opened your hearts to me and for expressing by means of this visit your desire for us to journey together.
I
would like to take up a few of the many things that have struck me. Let me start by saying that it is part of your traditional wisdom. It is not only a turn of phrase, but also a view of living. In every deliberation, we must consider the impact on the seventh generation. These are wise words, far-sighted, and the exact opposite of what often happens in our day, when we run after practical and immediate goals without thinking of the future and generations yet to come. Instead, the ties that connect the elderly and the young are essential. They must be cherished and protected lest we lose our historical memory and very identity. They must be cherished and protected, for whenever memory and identity are cherished and protected, we become more human. In these days, a beautiful image kept coming up. You compared yourselves to the branches of a tree. Like those branches, you have spread in different directions. You have experienced various times and seasons, and you have been buffeted by powerful winds, yet you have remained solidly anchored to your roots, which you kept strong. In this way, you've continued to bear fruit, for the branches of a tree grow high only if its roots are deep. I would like to speak of some of those fruits, which deserve to be better known and appreciated. First, your care for the land, which you see not as a resource to be exploited, but as a gift from heaven.
Ed è uno spazio vitale nel quale cogliere la propria esistenza all'interno.
For you, the land preserves the memory of your ancestors who rest there. It is a vital setting, making it possible to see each individual's life as part of a greater web of relationships with the Creator, with the human community, with all living species, and with the earth, our common home. All this leads you to seek interior and exterior harmony, to show great love for the family, and to possess a lively sense of community. Then, too, there are the particular riches of your languages, your cultures, your traditions, and your forms of art. These represent a patrimony that belongs not only to you, but to all humanity, for they are expressions of our common humanity. And yet, that tree, rich in fruit, has experienced a tragedy that you described to me in these past days, the tragedy of being uprooted. The chain that passed on knowledge and ways of life in union with the land was broken by a colonialization that lacked respect for you, tore many of you from your vital milieu and tried to conform you to another mentality. In this way, great harm was done to your identity and your culture. Many families were separated, and great numbers of children fell victim to these attempts to impose a uniformity based on the notion that progress occurs through ideological colonization, following programs devised in offices, rather than the desire to respect the life of peoples. This is something that, unfortunately, and at various levels, still happens today. That is ideological colonization. How many forms of political, ideological, and economic colonization still exists in the world today, driven by greed and thirst for profit, with little concern for peoples, their histories and traditions, and the common home of creation. Sadly, this colonial mentality remains widespread. Let us help each other together to overcome it. Listening to your voices, I was able to enter into and be deeply grieved by the stories of the suffering, hardship, discrimination, and various forms of abuse that some of you experienced, particularly in the residential schools. It's chilling to think of determined efforts to instill a sense of inferiority, to rob people of their cultural identity, to sever their roots, and to consider all the personal and social efforts that this continues to entail. Unresolved traumas that have become intergenerational traumas. All this made me feel two things very strongly: indignation and shame. Indignation because it is not right to accept evil, and even worse, to grow accustomed to evil, as if it were an inevitable part of the historical process. No. Without real indignation, without historical memory, and without a commitment to learning from past mistakes, problems remain unresolved and keep coming back. We can see it these days in the case of war. The memory of the past must never be sacrificed at the altar of alleged progress. I also feel shame. I'm saying it now and I'm repeating it. Sorrow and shame for the role that a number of Catholics, particularly those with educational responsibilities, have had in all these things that wounded you, in the abuses you suffered, and in the lack of respect shown for your identity, your culture, and even your spiritual values. All these things are contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. For the deplorable conduct of these members of the Catholic Church, I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry, and I join my brothers, the Canadian bishops, in asking your pardon. Clearly, the content of the faith cannot be transmitted in a way contrary to the faith itself. Jesus taught us to welcome love, serve, and not judge. It is frightening. It is a frightening thing, then, when precisely in the name of the faith, counter-witness is rendered to the gospel.
Che il Creatore rivolge all'umanità all'inizio della Bibbia. Dapprima, dopo la colpa commessa, chiede all'uomo: dove sei?
Your experiences have made me ponder anew these ever-timely questions that the Creator addresses to mankind. In the first pages of the Bible, after the first sin, He asks, "Where are you?" Then a few pages later, he asks another question inseparable from the first. Where is your brother? Where are you? Where is your brother? These are questions we should never stop asking. They are the essential questions raised by our conscience, lest we ever forget that we are here on this earth as guardians of the sacredness of life, and thus guardians of our brothers and sisters, and of all brother peoples. At the same time, I think with gratitude of all those good and decent believers who, in the name of the faith, and with respect, love, and kindness, have enriched your history with the gospel. I think with joy, for example, of the great veneration that many of you have for Saint Anne, the grandmother of Jesus. And I hope to be with you that day. Nowadays, we need to reestablish the covenant between grandparents and grandchildren, between the elderly and the young.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, auspico che gli incontri di questi giorni possano aprire strade ulteriori da percorrere insieme, infondere coraggio e accrescere l'impegno a livello locale.
We need to reestablish the covenant between grandparents and grandchildren, between the elderly and the young. For this is a fundamental prerequisite for the growth of unity in our human family. Dear brothers and sisters, it is my hope that our meetings in these days will point out new paths to be pursued together, instill courage and strength, and lead to greater commitment on the local level. Any truly effective process of healing requires requires concrete actions. In a fraternal spirit, I encourage the bishops and the Catholic community to continue taking steps towards the transparent search for truth and to foster healing and reconciliation. These steps are part of a journey that can favor the rediscovery and revitalization of your culture, while helping the Church to grow in love, respect, and specific attention to your authentic traditions. I wish to tell you that the Church stands beside you and wants to continue journeying with you. Dialogue is the key to knowledge and sharing, and the bishops of Canada have clearly stated their commitment to continue advancing together with you on a renewed, constructive, fruitful path where encounters and shared projects will be of great help. Dear friends, I have been enriched by your words and even more by your testimonies. You have brought here to Rome a living sense of your communities. I will be happy to benefit again from meeting you when I visit your native lands where your families live. I'm not going to go in winter, So I will close by saying until we meet again in Canada, where I will be able better to express to you my closeness. In the meantime, I assure you of my prayers, and upon you, your families, and your communities, I invoke the blessing of the Creator. Thank you. And I'd like to finish. I don't want to finish without saying a word to you, Brother Bishops. Thank you. Thank you for your courage. Thank you. And humility. The Spirit of the Lord is revealed in humility. Before history, like we've heard, the humiliation of the Church's fruitfulness. It's fruitful. Thank you for your courage. And thank you to all of you.
Powerful words from
Pope Francis, as you saw live earlier this morning, we want to play for you there, as we did, his remarks in their entirety, as he said words that the delegates told us after they had been longing to hear for decades, to quote the head of the Inuit delegation, words that are a long overdue apology, a first step, so critically, to many in that room, the Indigenous delegates. As part of our special coverage, we continue here on CBC News Network. Good morning. I'm Heather Hiscox. Let's look live once again at Vatican City. This historic week has concluded with that historic address and the commitment from Pope Francis. The Pope apologizing for the conduct of some Catholic Church members, those who are involved in Canada's residential school system. In that address to some 200 people assembled in that hall in the Apostolic Palace, he said to them he feels sorrow and shame, and he asked for God's forgiveness. He also promised to travel to Canada, where he said, to conclude his remarks, as you just heard moments ago, I will be better able to express my closeness. Now, we don't know when that visit will occur, but a papal apology in Canada is really central to call to action number 58, one of the key calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. It is something the Indigenous delegates have been hoping for, advocating for throughout their meetings this week. The Pope made those comments during that public address to all three delegations at the Vatican. They were joined by dozens of their family members, by friends and supporters who made the trip as well. I'm going to introduce you to one in just a moment, but let's bring you some scenes from earlier this morning. Indigenous performers dancing in St. Peter's Square after that final audience. The delegation leaving Sala Clementina, as it's called, and speaking to reporters, getting the first reactions from the leaders of all three delegations.
This morning, Pope Francis reflected upon the entirety of our message that we have brought forward. And he did so in a way that really showed his empathy towards the Indigenous people of Canada. He also showed a willingness to do something that the Catholic Church has not done yet, which is to frankly and openly offer an apology.
It's a historical first step however, only a first step. More news to be done to address the Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action number 58. The next step is for the Holy Father to apologize to our family at their home.
For me, I was deeply moved when we were reading along in English the words of the Pope, and I was sitting next to my elder, Angie Crier, who has been with me along this journey the entire time. She's the one who brought me around our Métis Nation homeland to hear the stories of our survivors. And when Angie and I were sharing a book and reading the book together, I pointed out the words, "I am sorry." She broke down into tears, and it was so moving because I know how important that is to her, and I know how important those words are going to be to our survivors back at home.
So as you heard there, the leaders of all three delegations in order: Nathan Obed from the Inuit delegation, Gerald Antoine from the First Nations delegation, and Cassidy Caron, who leads the Métis National Council, 29 years old, the first woman ever to hold that role. And their initial impressions at hearing the words, "I am sorry." Let's bring in Megan Williams as part of our special coverage this morning. She's still there in St. Peter's Square, has been watching all of this transpire live. So you heard all of those reactions in person, Megan, and I'll get to you in just a moment. But coming back to what the Pope said in that 13-minute address, the key headlines, what the delegates had been hoping to hear, longing to hear for a long, long time.
That's right, Heather. This was, it went beyond meeting the delegates' expectations. They were hoping that Pope Francis would make his indication that he was willing to visit Canada clear. Instead, he said clearly that he would come. He even named a date, St. Anne's Day, which is July 26th. It's not clear whether that's this year or next year, but he said he hoped to come then. And of course, he issued an apology. He said he was joining the Canadian bishops in chieder vi scusa, which means apologizing to you. He said he has also asked God for forgiveness for the sins of the Catholic Church against Indigenous peoples. He talked a lot about the crimes, the harms of colonialism, but he also talked specifically about very carefully listening to and understanding the damage that was done to children in residential schools, in family, and the devastating cultural damage to the families, to Indigenous communities. And once again, he says he wants to come to those lands, possibly July 26, and to be close with the people there. He didn't say he's going to issue another apology, but most people here expect that will happen once again.
Yes, until we meet again in Canada, where I will be able to better express to you my closeness. That's a direct quote from the Pope's remarks. So it sounds like that there could be even further comment at that time and take the Pope even closer to what is demanded in Call to Action 58 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But as you said, Megan, it was striking to see the delegations all emerge from that final public audience, some to step to that microphone and to express that this has gone beyond their expectations. What did you hear particularly from them that stood out?
Well, for me, it was particularly moving hearing from the former National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Phil Fontaine, because, of course, he was here in 2009. He met with Benedict XVI. He was hoping for some sort of an apology then. That didn't come. Benedict XVI expressed his sorrow, his anguish for what had happened to Indigenous peoples in Canada, but there was no apology. And so Phil Fontaine said, you know, he was very happy that this was a step forward, and this was the result of the world watching, particularly after the discoveries at the residential schools this summer, and of course the apology that finally came from Canadian bishops in late October, which people here say, Vatican insiders here say, that the Vatican and the Pope was waiting for that to come before Pope Francis himself would issue an apology.
Megan, thank you very much, and thank you for all of the coverage through this week. Megan Williams there, right in St. Peter's Square, live for us. Now, again, we're going to show you some more of the moments you may have missed in the final audience with the delegates and Pope Francis. Each of the delegations gave gifts to the Pope, very specifically chosen, absolutely filled with symbolism. Let's look at some of them for you. This is the one of the gifts from the Assembly of First Nations. In fact, there were two, but the first, the traditional snowshoe. And we got details about this, handmade from black ash with caribou and artificial sinew. And the second, Phil Fontaine there at the center, alongside with two of the First Nations women, a beaded leather stole, the liturgical garment that priests wear, decorated with orange beaded crosses. Again, orange, the particular color for the missing children. Want to give you an image of the gift to show you more closely. I think we saw it there already, what it looked like as it was presented to the Pope. Now, from the Métis delegation, they chose, in asking the members of their community what they wanted to give to the Pope, a book of memories. And here is an image of the cover. And you can see, if you look closely at this, what it covers. The scenes of being picked up by buses, taken to those schools, stories from the survivors in that book to the Pope, and a letter at the end from the president of the Métis National Council, Cassidy Caron. And finally, from the Inuit delegation, a cross and pouch made from the baleen of a bowhead whale, riveted to sterling silver with 18-karat gold. That pouch is sealskin. There you see it again, hand-sewn, finished with an ivory button, encased in 18-karat gold bezel there. And this is all designed by the Nunavut Arctic College, the instructors and students in the jewelry program. And again, the Pope smiling to all of the delegations as he received those gifts. Again, there's a close-up of that which the Inuit delegation offered him. At the end, the Pope presented gifts in return, and here they are, an olive branch cast in bronze, given as a symbol of peace and reconciliation to each of the delegations. And as you heard from Nigan Sinclair as we were speaking earlier, viewing this as a tremendous symbol and a gesture of peace and working together toward reconciliation on a new path. More of our special coverage today ahead on CBC News Network.